Welcome back to another deep dive. I'm so excited to jump into this one because we have a really highly specific mission for you today.
We really do, and it's a critical one.
Yeah, we are mastering a pivotal area of applied behavior analysis today. We're looking at BCBA Foundation's E10, which focuses entirely on culturally responsive and inclusive practice.
Which is, arguably one of the most complex, nuanced aspects of ethical service delivery in the field today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are moving far beyond the sort of sterile, theoretical science of behavior, and we're stepping into the messy, vibrant reality of human homes and actual communities.
Right. And to give you, the listener, the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed, whether you are prepping for your BCBA exam or maybe you're utilizing resources like the therapy services study guides, we've stacked up some incredibly insightful sources for this.
Some really great material to work through.
Yeah. We are pulling directly from the official BACB ethics code, exploring these gritty case studies from Maley and Birch's book, Ethics for Behavior Analysts, and, extracting vital nuggets from multiple BAS mock exams.
So we're really covering all the bases.
Exactly. We're going to figuring how to adapt interventions to diverse populations, build inclusive supervision strategies, and genuinely respect cultural differences.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin?
Well, the best place to start is just with the foundational language that the BACB expects practitioners to internalize.
Makes sense. Gotta know the terms.
Right. Before anyone can ethically apply inclusive practices in a clinic, they have to understand the precise definitions in the ethics code. Specifically, we're talking about standards 1.07, 1.08, and 1.0.
Okay, so what's the big distinction there?
The field makes a critical distinction between two concepts that honestly sound identical but function very differently, and those are cultural responsiveness and cultural humility.
See, I always just thought of those as interchangeable buzzwords, to be honest. A lot of people do. But reading through the sources, it becomes clear that one is about outward action and the other is about, well, internal wiring.
Oh, that's a really good way to frame it. So cultural responsiveness is the outward action.
Exactly. It's your active learning repertoire. Say you're assigned a client from a culture you have literally never interacted with. Cultural responsiveness is the physical act of doing your homework.
Like researching their community norms and that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. You seek out literature on their family dynamics, and you actively figure out how to adapt your evidence-based treatments to fit their specific reality. It's how you respectfully relate to people of different backgrounds.
Which means cultural humility, then, is the internal piece.
You got it. It's the willingness to look in the mirror,
And
essentially.
so you have to constantly audit your own personal biases, your own cultural identity, and figure out how your internal lens is coloring your clinical judgment.
And that internal audit requires a massive shift in perspective. I mean, you have to start with the baseline assumption that the contingencies, like the rewards, the rules, the consequences that produced a family's behavior, are completely genuine and valid.
Even if they look entirely foreign to your own upbringing.
Precisely.
Thinking about how those external inputs interact with internal wiring, it actually brings to mind a different analogy than the standard bespoke suit versus cookie-cutter template they talk about in the Bailey and Birch text.
Oh, what are you thinking?
It feels almost like dealing with computer operating systems. Let's say the universal principles of human learning, like positive reinforcement, are the raw hardware. The hardware is exactly the same for every human being.
Okay, I follow you.
But a person's culture is their operating system. It's the software. So if ABA is a science based on universal principles, why does the cultural fabric matter so much? Well, if you try to run Western normed intervention software on an Eastern culture operating system...
The system is going to crash.
Exactly. The hardware isn't broken, but the baseline code is entirely different.
That operating system analogy hits the nail on the head, because the underlying mechanics of behavioral science, like reinforcement or extinction, are universal.
Right.
They absolutely apply to all human beings. However, what functions as a reinforcer, or how a specific goal is processed by the individual, is entirely dictated by that cultural software.
I imagine this plays out with something as simple as praise, right? Like bringing a child to the front of the classroom and giving them a loud round of applause.
Well, that's a perfect example.
Because that might be a massive positive reinforcer for one kid, but completely humiliate another depending on their cultural background.
The sources highlight that exact dynamic.
Yeah.
In a culture that prioritizes individual achievement and standing out, public praise works beautifully. The behavior increases.
Sure.
But in a culture that heavily prioritizes group harmony, collectivism, and humility, Singling a child out with public praise is deeply uncomfortable. It actually functions as a punisher.
Wow. So if you apply your standard behavioral software without understanding the cultural operating system, your scientifically sound intervention will completely fail.
It will backfire entirely.
Which brings up a massive tip for you listening, especially if you are utilizing mock exams to prep for the board. The BCBA exam frequently tests your awareness of personal biases under Code 1.10.
Yes, it comes up all the time.
And the golden rule across all the study materials is that a lack of awareness is never a defense against an ethics violation.
Never. You cannot stand before the board and say, oh, I just didn't know their culture viewed praise that way.
Right. The board requires active, ongoing self-evaluation.
Ignorance is simply not a shield in ethical practice.
Mm.
You are expected to anticipate these friction points.
So understanding these definitions is one thing, but how does this actually dictate the way a practitioner conducts assessments and interventions out there in the field?
Well, we see this constantly when we look at behavior norms on a really granular level.
Yeah.
For instance, the study guides bring up the concept of topography.
And for anyone new to the term, topography just means what a behavior physically looks like on the outside, right?
Exactly, the literal physical movements. And the topography of a behavior can mean entirely different things depending on whose living room you are standing in.
So like eye contact and vocal volume.
Those are the classic examples. In many Western corporate cultures, making direct, sustained eye contact and speaking loudly is heavily reinforced. It's universally coded as a sign of confidence and honesty.
Right, active engagement. But in many indigenous or Eastern cultures, that exact same physical topography is viewed so differently.
Radically differently.
Staring directly into someone's eyes and projecting your voice is considered incredibly aggressive and disrespectful, particularly with an elder or a teacher.
So consider the danger here. A behavior analyst walks into a home to conduct a standardized assessment, and they are completely blind to this cultural difference.
Oh, no.
They might observe a child looking down at the floor when spoken to, and the analyst incorrectly targets lack of eye contact as a social deficit that needs to be fixed.
That is terrifying. You are essentially writing an insurance-funded medical goal to train a child to be highly disrespectful to their own parents in their own home.
Yes, you are literally teaching them to violate their own cultural norms.
And the Bailey and Birch text actually provides some wild, real-world case studies where this goes completely off the rails.
Oh, there's so many examples of what happens when the cultural operating system is ignored.
Yeah, I eagerly want to share the specific scenario from the sources. Case 17. Canceled considerations. It's basically a masterclass in what we could call a monolingual mess.
That case is a perfect storm of systemic failures, honestly.
So in this scenario, a new BCBA takes over a caseload, and what she finds in the files from the previous analyst is shocking. First, the previous BCBA was working with a family whose primary language was Mandarin.
Okay.
But instead of securing a professional translator, the BCBA just used the client's 7-year-old sibling to translate all the complex medical information.
Which is just the psychological damage that causes to the family dynamic is immense. By using a 7-year-old as a translator, the practitioner is essentially parentifying the child. They're completely upending the power dynamic of the household and marginalizing the parents.
Not to mention, there is absolutely zero guarantee that complex behavioral terminology is being accurately conveyed by a second grader.
Exactly. But it gets worse, doesn't it?
Oh, it gets so much worse. The previous BCBA didn't stop there. She wrote a behavior goal forcing the learner to use a fork and spoon, completely ignoring the parent's explicit request to teach the child to use chopsticks.
Wow.
Chopsticks were literally the only utensil the family actually used at the dinner table. And she also had another learner, whose family were strict Jehovah's Witnesses, spend therapy time making a birthday card.
Oh, totally oblivious to the fact that their religion strictly forbids celebrating birthdays. It is a total disregard for the client's reality.
Completely.
Let's just look at the mechanics of the chopsticks example for a second. If you teach a child to use a fork and spoon in a vacuum, but the family only sets the table with chopsticks,
that fork and spoon behavior will never contact natural reinforcement in the home.
Exactly. The behavior will undergo extinction the second the therapist leaves the room.
Okay, but I have to push back on something here. Standardized assessments are, by definition, standardized.
Yeah.
They are norm-referenced against a specific sample of thousands of people so that the data is objective. So if every single culture has different norms, how on earth do you objectively assess a client without completely invalidating the test?
What's fascinating here is that the field of behavior analysis openly acknowledges this exact limitation. Standardized tests carry inherent cultural biases because they were almost exclusively normed on a specific Western middle-class demographic.
Right. So how do we resolve this without throwing out the science?
The source material makes it clear practitioners must supplement their assessment tools. You don't throw the test away, you just don't rely on it as the absolute gospel truth.
So you never use a standardized score in a vacuum.
Right. You run the assessment, but then you conduct open-ended ecological interviews. You talk to family members or even community leaders if the parents consent to understand what is actually expected within that specific micro-community.
Because the ultimate filter for any intervention is social validity, which is a term that pops up everywhere in the mock exams.
It's the ultimate litmus test. Does this goal actually matter to the client's real life?
Teaching a child to use a fork and spoon might be a milestone on a generic assessment checklist, but if the family exclusively uses chopsticks, the fork and spoon goal has zero social validity in that environment.
Exactly. And an intervention without social validity is ultimately useless, no matter how scientifically rigorous the teaching method was.
Okay, so adapting goals to fit the culture sounds very logical on paper. But as we transition into the next theme, things get incredibly muddy when a family's cultural norms collide directly with company policies.
Or worse, deeply ingrained personal biases. The ethical dilemmas become highly complex here.
Yeah, let's talk about implicit bias, because these aren't always malicious, conscious decisions, right?
No, often they are systemic heuristics that result in active discrimination.
Like in case 14, discrimination discrepancy. In this scenario, a clinic director is auditing her staff's data and notices this glaring pattern. One of her BCBAs is consistently providing significantly fewer parent training hours to lower-income families.
Oh, right.
And when confronted, the BCBA casually defends it, saying providing the training is a waste of time because lower-income parents are always working or just not interested.
That is the textbook definition of implicit bias manifesting as a medical dosage error. The practitioner allowed a classist stereotype to dictate how much health care a family received.
Which is a direct violation of providing equitable treatment under Code 1.08. You have to actively fight those assumptions.
Absolutely. You have to analyze your own data to ensure your service delivery isn't being skewed.
The sources also provide a really fascinating look at how discrimination plays out internally among colleagues, specifically regarding Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Yes, the workplace discrimination cases.
Right. There's Case 1.08, discrimination at work. The text outlines a scenario where a professional suspects, they were removed from a clinical team, either because they were in a same-sex relationship or because their social media profile picture included a Black Lives Matter tagline.
And it's important to note how the Bailey and Birch text uses this case.
Exactly. And just to be clear for the listener, we are remaining strictly neutral here, simply reporting this factual example from the text to illustrate the boundaries of the BACB's non-discrimination policy.
Right. The core takeaway is that a behavior analyst cannot be denied employment, alienated, or removed from a case based on sexual orientation, race, or political expression outside of the workplace.
The ethical code demands an inclusive environment.
Yes. If the profession is going to preach cultural responsiveness for clients, it must mandate that exact same inclusion for its practitioners.
But sometimes the ethics code itself seems to be the very thing causing the cultural friction.
Oh, for sure.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to bring up case 1.1 Fusey. Don't be rude. This is the Moroccan lunch dilemma.
Oh, this is a classic scenario.
You have a behavior therapist providing in-home services, right? And the Moroccan family spends the entire morning cooking a massive, traditional meal to welcome them.
A beautiful gesture.
But rejecting this food is considered a profound insult in their culture. Meanwhile, the BACB Code 1.12 has a strict rule: no gifts over $10.
Yes, the strict $10 limit.
So how do you navigate a situation where following the strict letter of the ethics code actually damages the therapeutic relationship before it even starts?
This scenario perfectly isolates the tension between the spirit of the code and the letter of the code.
Because the mechanical function of Code 1.12 is to prevent conflicts of interest.
Exactly. You want to avoid a dynamic where a client is essentially bribing a therapist for preferential treatment. However, the overarching core principles of the ethics code also mandate that we treat clients with compassion, dignity, and respect.
So how does a supervisor actually resolve this mechanically? You can't just tell the therapist to eat the food in secret.
No, definitely not.
But you also can't let them nuke the therapeutic relationship on day one.
The expert consensus in the text is that the organization must adapt its policies to synthesize these rules. Code 1.92 requires flexibility and cultural sensitivity here.
So they make a formalized exception.
Yes, the supervisor steps in and documents that sharing a cultural meal upon initial intake is an acceptable, clinically necessary moment of rapport building.
Oh, I see.
They set a firm boundary ensuring this doesn't become a daily, recurring event that crosses into a conflict of interest. But they permit that initial exchange to honor the family's cultural operating system.
It's about navigating the gray area with clear, documented, clinical justification. You don't just blindly throw the rule book at a family if it's going to destroy the trust you need to actually help them.
Precisely.
And, mastering that kind of nuanced gray area navigation is tough enough for one person. But according to Code 4.07, once a BCBA figures this out for themselves, their next ethical mandate is ensuring that their supervisees do the exact same thing.
That transitions us perfectly into inclusive supervision strategies, which is tied to task list I3. Clinical supervision is not just about teaching a trainee how to collect data on a clipboard.
Right. It's way deeper than that.
The supervisor has an explicit responsibility to actively incorporate diversity and inclusion topics into their training. You have to monitor a trainee's cultural competence just as rigorously as you monitor their understanding of, say, reinforcement schedules.
But here's my question. It's one thing to check our own biases in private, but how do we ethically correct a supervisee's bias without creating a hostile work environment or making them incredibly defensive?
That is the big challenge. The psychology of defensiveness is exactly why this is so difficult. When you tell a supervisee they are biased, their brain often interprets that as a social survival threat.
Oh, like an amygdala hijack.
Right. Exactly. The amygdala fires, the threat response activates, the prefrontal cortex essentially shuts down, and all learning stops. They can't process the feedback because they are too busy defending their ego.
So how do you bypass that threat response?
The source material provides a clear mechanical framework for this. It's all about establishing psychological safety through competency-based training and scaffolding.
Meaning you don't just wait for them to mess up.
Right. You do not wait for a supervisee to make a culturally insensitive mistake and then hit them with punitive feedback. From day one, you establish a foundation where discussing bias is just normalized.
You use case studies as a sandbox, essentially.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of pointing a finger at their actual clinical cases initially, you bring hypothetical scenarios into supervision, like the Moroccan lunch or the chopsticks goal.
And you ask them how they'd handle it.
Yes. You present the case and ask, how would you handle this? You guide them through self-reflection exercises with open-ended questions, like, how do you think your own upbringing might influence how you view this client's behavior?
Wow, so you are essentially using behavioral shaping on your own trainees. You're prompting them to discover their own blind spots, engaging their prefrontal cortex, rather than just delivering a reprimand that triggers their amygdala.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a supervisor takes the time to shape a supervisee's cultural humility in this way, they aren't just improving that one trainee's clinical skills.
What else are they doing?
The supervisor is ultimately responsible for the public's entire impression of applied behavior analysis. By fostering this inclusion, they are protecting vulnerable clients, and shaping a supervisee's cultural humility is protecting the entire profession.
It really reframes the role of a supervisor completely. You aren't just a middle manager tracking billable hours. You are the gatekeeper for the ethics of the field.
You really are.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's bring all these sources together. Whether you are rigorously studying for the BCBA exam or you are already out there sitting on the floor of a clinic, cultural responsiveness is an ongoing active pursuit.
It cannot just be a corporate buzzword.
Exactly. It is the baseline for effective, ethical service delivery. Interventions must be bespoke. They have to be socially valid and tailored to the cultural operating system of the family.
And if you're in a leadership role, you must build equity and psychological safety directly into the architecture of your supervision training models.
It is the only way the science of behavior analysis can actually fulfill its promise to improve human lives.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawn from the text's assertion that we must view a family's cultural contingencies as genuine and valid.
Oh, I love these. Let's hear it.
Consider this scenario. You have a client whose behaviors are perfectly adapted to the cultural contingencies inside their home. They function beautifully within the walls of their family unit.
Okay.
But those exact same behaviors face harsh, punishing contingencies in the broader outside society. As a behavior analyst, Is your ethical duty to change the client so they fit seamlessly into the world? Or is it your duty to advocate for the world to accommodate the client?